uncle, but he wasn't really. They were really first cousins. Mordecai's father and Esther's father were brothers. And so Mordecai sends a message to Esther, and he says, when the nation of the Jews were in peril of being completely annihilated, a plan for genocide had been laid out, in fact, written into law, that the entire nation would be exterminated in one day. And so Mordecai wrote a note or sent a message to Esther and said, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Now, I want to begin by giving you a little background. I was hoping, Brother Eccles, who has been a lifelong minister of the gospel and now almost 85 years old, 84, almost 85 years old. And if he had been here, some of you people would say, "Boy, now this pastor is telling me things that I've never heard before. I don't believe this is right." He could have validated what I'm saying to you. But his son is preaching in Tulsa this weekend, and so Brother Eccles sent me a message that they were going to go and spend the morning with his son in ministry, and I think that's what I would do if I was in his place. But what I'm going to tell you is perhaps a little bit different than what you have thought before. So when you look at the books of history in the Old Testament, and you get the part where the books come in order: Ezra, Nehemiah, and then Esther, these three books, people have generally considered that chronologically, Ezra was first, then Nehemiah, and then Esther. But that is absolutely not the case. Of those three books, the story that happened first was Esther. And then the next part was about the first 7 chapters of the book of Nehemiah. Then the book of Ezra happened. And then finally, the final chapters of Nehemiah, when the temple was finished and a commitment had been made to serve the Lord there in the house of worship, was actually the end of this 3-book story. And the reason that's significant, first of all, the Bible tells us that Mordecai, the cousin of of Esther, was taken into captivity with the first realm of people that were taken captive when Jerusalem fell initially. And that was at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar came in about the year 606 years before Jesus and began the captivity that Isaiah had prophesied. Isaiah said it would last 70 years. And it began, and Mordecai was taken captive actually into Babylon. But he was moved in his captivity from Babylon to Shushan, which was part of an exterior kingdom, part of actually what is today Iran. And Babylon was part of Iraq. And so this, how the story begins to unfold. So that Esther was spending the majority of her captivity, though she had been led away captive by the Babylonians, she was under the jurisdiction of Persia in the majority of her early life. And Persia had its own kingdom, but they were subservient to the Babylonians. The Babylonians was the world empire of the day. And so Babylon would take a lot of their captives that came from all the other tributaries that they had put under them, and they would move them out of their home into exile, and they would replant them in Persia. And that way they didn't have to deal with, all the welfare that was based, that would take to keep these people alive. Put that over onto the Persians, but yet they moved them out of their homeland so that they would not rise up in insurrection to try to overthrow the government. And so during these days, Ahasuerus had a wife. The Bible records this story, but history is replete in mentioning this event when Ahasuerus' wife fell out of favor in his eyes, and they divorced, and he took away from her the right of being queen. And after a couple of years, he got lonely, and so his counselor said, what you need to do is you need to get the most beautiful women in the entire land of Persia and bring them all into your harem. And then after you've had all these concubines, all these women, then you pick out the very best and make her queen. And he said, well, that's what I'm going to do. And so Esther was actually she was a captive. She was exiled. And then when she was taken into the king's palace, I've heard people talk about being an honor. It really, I guess it meant people thought she was pretty, but it wasn't an honor. She was a slave. She was a concubine. She had never met the king. She just lived with the rest of the harem. And that was the state that she found herself in. Now, folks, that would have been a good time for most people to say, you know what, I give up. I give up on God. He let me be taken captive out of my homeland because of the sins of the other people. It wasn't even my doing. I didn't do it. I didn't turn my back on God. Yet I've been taken captive, first into Babylon, now into Persia. And after I was just virtually a street person in Persia, now I've been made a slave. And I've never even met the king. I've never even met him. But instead, she kept her faith. She maintained her integrity. And she was given this opportunity. All the whatever cosmetics, beauty products, anything she wanted, it would be given her because of her position. She was in the king's harem. And whatever clothes she wanted, she could get the most beautiful clothes, silk, whatever was available. Whatever you want, whatever you love, you can wear those clothes. You can have those beauty products. Hairstylist, whatever, anything you want to make you more beautiful, we'll give it to you. So what do you want? And the thing about Esther was she did something that not one of the other girls did. She went to the chamberlain who was in charge of the harem and says, when they're all saying, well, I like this style of dress, or I like this color. She goes to the chamberlain and she says, tell me what color the king likes. See, what Esther has done here is taught us how to approach God. Because what we have in 2016 is a church that's trying to figure out how to make God give them what they want. But instead, what we need to be doing is what Esther did. We need to go to the Holy Spirit and say, show us what he wants. Don't make me what I want to look like. Make me look like he wants me to look. Don't teach me to talk the way the world wants me to talk. Teach me to speak like it pleases the king. And she made a life career out of becoming pleasing to a man that she had never personally met. And the day came when she would spend her one day with the king. One day. One chance. And if she met the king on this one occasion and they had no rapport, she would never be called again. Her life as a young woman, a prospective wife. It was over one day to spend with the king. But she spent that time in preparation to learn everything about what it takes to please the king. And hundreds of women from across the land of Persia had been selected to meet the king. And each of them had their one night. Their one night. But when Esther met the king, he stole her heart. She stole his heart. And he said, this experiment is over. You can let the ladies all go home. This is my queen. And he married Esther. And he put the crown upon her head. Now that was the blessing. When you want to read more about Esther and what that woman was like, you look at the 31st chapter of the book of Proverbs. A woman of virtue. That was Esther. And she won the heart of the king. But her life meant more than that. There came a day when Israel, or the Jews, had an enemy. Now, the Bible describes this man, Haman, in one way in the book of Esther in terms of his nationality. But it's likely that this man was an Amalekite. That's an interesting thing. There should not have been an Amalekite on the face of the earth. Because God had given an order to King Saul, the first king of Israel, that he should annihilate the entire nation of the Amalekites. But he didn't do it. You remember the story? When Saul died, he died at the hand of the Amalekite. If he had done what he was supposed to have done, the Amalekite would not have been there to take his life. And furthermore, this was hundreds of years later, the Amalekite was there to put a curse in the law books against the Jews. So that on one day, every Jew in all the land of the Persians, in one day, they would all be put to death. And so when this word came out, the Jews were mourning. They were wailing. The day was coming, facing them, when there would be a complete genocide. Their entire nation would be destroyed. But they had, the queen was one of them, unbeknownst to Haman. In fact, apparently, even the king didn't know her nationality. And so, Mordecai said to Esther, you've got to go to the king, and you've got to ask him to spare your nation. And if you don't ask him to spare your nation, you'll die with the rest of us. God will send deliverance from some way, but certainly the Jew that's living right in the palace, right under the nose, so to speak, of the king will not escape, and we'll all die. She said, well, I can't go to the king. It's been over 30 days since I've been called in to see the king. If anyone goes to see the king without being called, it's an immediate execution. I could lose my life unless the king would give me favor. And I have no assurance that'll happen. He's not called for me for over a month. He didn't want to even see me. And Mordecai said, well, could be that you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And so the entire nation, the Jews, in exile, spent 3 days in fasting. Didn't eat bread, didn't drink water, nothing for 3 days. And then Esther went and stood at the door to the throne room. And when she could have had her head taken off her shoulders immediately, the king gave her favor and pointed toward her the golden scepter. This is a long story. I'm going to move past the details of how it happened, simply to say to you, because that she had the blessing of God on her life, and she stood before the king, deliverance was granted to her nation. And the entire kingdom was saved. Now, this happened about 30 years after the Jews had originally gone into captivity of Babylon. And soon after the Jews were spared by this this great act of God through Esther. Esther had a child, and that child's name was Cyrus. We've talked about that already today. Little boy grew up in the king's palace and became the general of the army. Now, this isn't Bible trivia continue, but I got to ask, how many of y'all remember why Daniel fasted his 21-day fast? How many remember? Nobody. Good. So I can tell you anything, and you'll just believe what I'm going to say because you don't remember. Now, it was about this. This is a side story. You haven't heard anything about Daniel in the story so far. But Daniel was a great lover of God, a great lover of God. He had been taken away captive in the second wave of captives that had left Israel. But because the favor of God was upon him, he had been elevated to a position of being actually one of the top officials in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar had found favor in Nebuchadnezzar's sight because God had given him the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, was on the throne at this time, and Belshazzar was not much of a man. Nebuchadnezzar was a great man, but his grandson, who became king after him, was not so great a man. And so the day came. First, let me tell you this part of the story. Daniel gets to looking around, and Israel's been in captivity now. Jews have been in captivity now for over 60 years. Matter of fact, around 65 years. And he's saying, God, the prophecy said we'd be in captivity 70 years and then go home. But it doesn't look like we're getting ready to go home. If anything, it looks like we're in more bondage now than we were when we first got here. And I want to know what's happening. So no answer. So he prayed and fasted 21 days. The story sound familiar to anybody yet? And after 21 days, the angel Gabriel stood next to him, and that was when he said, now, Daniel, I want you to know that God first heard you pray 21 days ago when you started to afflict your soul and fast. That's when God heard you, and he sent me then. And when I came with your answer, I was withstood by the princes of Persia. The princes of spiritual forces in the heavenlies, the princes of Persia withstood me. And after I leave here, I'm going to have to go do battle with the princes of Greece. Now, you ancient historians know that this is exactly how the succession went. First the kingdom of Babylon, then the kingdom of Persia, and then the kingdom of Greece. This is the way. The significance of that is, we're not going to fully investigate that today, but I'm just telling you that this represented things that were happening in heaven that dictated how kingdoms would rise on the earth. Daniel had fasted 21 days because he said, God had promised to set us free in 70 years. It's been over 65 years. 5 years we're supposed to be back in Jerusalem, and it doesn't look like we're getting any closer to Jerusalem than we were. And he prayed. And so Belshazzar was having a party, and they were drinking for months. The leaders of that country had been in a drunken stupor for months. And then Belshazzar gets this idea, hey, you remember my grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, had gone to Israel and into Jerusalem, and one of the 7 wonders of the world, I don't know if he knew that, but one of the 7 wonders of the world was Solomon's temple. And Nebuchadnezzar had gone into the temple and had stolen or plundered from the temple of Solomon golden vessels that were used in worship of God. And they'd been put in the treasury of the king in Babylon. And Belshazzar said, let's go get those cups. Let's go get those golden cups that they used to worship God in Jerusalem, and let's just keep drinking, and we're going to use those cups to drink out of. And when he did that, and when those cups got passed around, now this is the part of the story that everybody remember. This, everything I've told you right now, you may not have remembered. You remember this. When this was happening, And Belshazzar was drunk, and all of his leaders were drunk, and everybody in the party was drunk. Suddenly, over on the wall, a man's hand appeared. And with a finger, he began to write on the wall. And there was silence in the party. The music stopped. The dancing stopped. The drinking stopped. And the Bible said that Belshazzar's hip joints were loose and that his knees smote one against the other as he watched this hand writing on the wall. He couldn't read it. And someone said, you know, Daniel, that wise man, that prophet, that seer, he has the ability to interpret mysteries. He might be able to read this and tell the king what the message is that hand wrote on the wall. They sent for Daniel, and Daniel came and said, I'll tell you what it says. King, it says your kingdom is weighed in the balances and found wanting. And tonight your kingdom will be taken away from you and given to someone that's more worthy than you. Tonight that's going to happen. And that night, as the party came to an end, the armies of the Medes and the Persians, led by a young general named Cyrus, came into Babylon and overtook the nation. And the kingdom of Babylon fell to the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And within 3 years of that battle that was fought, Cyrus' father abdicated the throne. Cyrus became king of the Persians. And he said, and it's written in the book of Ezra, the Lord God of all the heaven and earth has decreed that I should send the captives back to Jerusalem, and that I should build for him a house of worship in the city of Jerusalem. Now, that's an amazing thing. It's an amazing that Isaiah's 200-year-old prophecy would be fulfilled. It's amazing that about the first official order of a new king would be to take the exiles and send them home. But not quite so much amazing when you realize that that man was in fact a Jew. One half of his genetic makeup was of the seed of Abraham. Now that's a long story. I hope that some of it was interesting to you, and it may have been things that you haven't heard before. But it's telling you something, mothers. It's telling you beyond your ability to comprehend, you have an influence. You have an influence on what's happening in your home, what's happening in your more extended family, and even what's happening in the nation. What's happening in the entire world is being influenced by your life, by you.